Hi, thank you for joining us at 4. I'm very thankful for people who are with us this morning at 9. So this is our last session before the final words and presentation and discussion by our provost, soon to be president, Reginald de Roche. But right now, I would like to present two great panelists dealing with the Caribbean. So I'm dealing a lot with Martinique. I'm like, yay, home. So welcome for being here in person or whenever you're going to watch the videos for people who are in the room. We really appreciate you, and be patient with us with the technology. There's always something, but let's keep on smiling because it's all about sharing the love and collaborate with each other. So we're going to first Dr. Anny Curtius, who is going to present, yes, the title will be The Climate of Theory, Hurricane Slave Skeletons, Geology of Silence, Tidal Dialectics. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Christopher Church, whose presentation title is Only If You Count the People of Color, Disaster, Capitalism, and the Myth of Color Blindedness in France. And as I said, all those scholars are great. Click on our website, you will see their names, you could click on them and learn more about them. Thank you, and we're going to have our little tech preparing the PowerPoint.
Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Rice University, for organizing such a rich, interdisciplinary conversation about very important environmental and philosophical, so to speak, and social issues that we have to deal with. So I believe that this conversation is should have started much earlier. We should have been more aware of those things and started this cross-disciplinary conversation. But at least we are right in the middle of it, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to share my work with you. So I'm going to start right away with a set of critical positionalities. It's more or less like notions, concepts that I'm going to throw in, right at the beginning. So just sort of kick off the conversation. Excavate the skeletons of slaves. Desecrate slave burial grounds. Rebury the remains. Protect the resting places. Theorize or decolonize the archaeology of silence and the archaeology of absence. Those are the entangled statements that I want to propose to initiate my analysis on the ways in which historians, cultural critics, archaeologists, and communities reshape, transfigure, and occupy the entangled archives of slavery in the Caribbean and carve out new memorializing grounds. Images of shackled bodies confined head to foot in the hold of a slave ship have become a familiar iconography of the horrific conditions of the forced migrations of enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. Detailed diagrams and sketches of cross-sections of slave ships showing rows of bodies and marked as cargo have filled the pages of enslavers' logbooks and circulated across times as the only official archives of the Middle Passage. Today, I want to focus on a different type of representation of enslaved bodies, that of archaeologists studying slave burial grounds and skeletons that were excavated by the ocean, by hurricanes, by climate change. This image I propose could actually become more familiar as more burial grounds could potentially be discovered over time because of climate change or powerful hurricanes blasting through the Circum-Caribbean region and disfiguring the land. I want to argue first that this picture on the right, which documents the groundbreaking archaeological work conducted on slave burial grounds in the field of archaeology of slavery, stands to me as a groundbreaking counter narrative of the official iconography of enslaved bodies that you have on the left. Second, as a cultural critique, I must interrogate the ways in which we can examine the wide range of critical positionalities that the two images trigger. In fact, multiple discourses emerge from the archive of the dehumanization of slaves on the left, and this counter narrative on the right, which with time is doomed to become another type of archive. Indeed, when the bones that you see on the right, okay, will be stored, classified, organized, cataloged, exhibited, and then digitized and studied, new information will be provided on the material culture and living conditions of enslaved populations. The third point is that we must also consider how communities, activists, and grassroots organizations reassess and reappropriate these burial grounds as they are working through the trauma of slavery and resilience to the trauma. On this third point, I want to suggest that the ultimate spiritual and geopolitical reappropriation of the skeletons of enslaved ancestors are the preface of another type of counter narrative that I will identify as an archive, AN/archive. Overall, various types of implicated actors, as well as memory communities, are formed here. Subjectivities are impacted, tested, and challenged through transformative experience. So how were these skeletons discovered? In 1995, Hurricanes Iris, Louis, and Marilyn blasted through the French overseas department of Guadeloupe with powerful waves, wind gusts, heavy rains, so all the ingredients of hurricanes causing long-term effects. With these hurricanes, while these hurricanes remain in collective memory among the most damaging ones, and while the trauma that they generate is cyclically reactivated every time Caribbean populations grapple with the long-time effects of these hurricanes, there is another important phenomenon which occurs. Indeed, massive soil erosion had suddenly excavated slave burial grounds on popular tourist beaches of Guadeloupe. The appearance of these skeletons not only unearthed a suppressed archive, but they also triggered a resurgence of trauma. Since slaves, whether they were baptized or not, were not buried in official cemeteries during the times of slavery, their bodies were commonly put into non-registered mass graveyards located on backshore dunes near the ocean. Thus, the discovery of the skeletons of these beaches prompted grassroots organizations to ponder whether these beaches should be repurposed and permanently transformed into sacred memory sites. A similar phenomenon happened on the island of Reno, which is another French overseas department in the Indian Ocean, because in 2007, after Hurricane Ganed severely impacted the island with record rainfall and flooding, slave skeletons, again, were also excavated by the ocean. So here you have an archaeological site and archaeologists preparing the ground to study the bones. And the sample slave cemetery was actually inaugurated in 2019 following all the archaeological work done in this area. With the discoveries of these burial grounds, the French National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research carried out studies on enslaved population for the first time since the abolition of slavery in the French colonies in 1848. And these studies allowed archaeologists to sort of shift from an archaeology of absence and silence to a mortuary archaeology of slavery. From another critical perspective, evidently this oceanic and land surge of skeletons forces us to rethink how climate change and history are intertwined here. But we also see how the land and the ocean surrounding the cemetery stand as intangible witnesses of resistance, survival, suffering, as well as symbolic spaces of affects, channeling commemoration dynamics and ceremonies by grassroots and religious communities. Now, I want to focus on the community's perspective as an archive. And I will focus on two organizations. One in St. Eustatius, a Dutch territory in the Caribbean, and one in Guadeloupe. In St. Eustatius, an organization led by the chair of the Ubuntu Connected Front Caribbean, which is a political party, coordinated protests to stop what they call the unethical disturbance of their enslaved ancestors. In this case, the skeletons of the slaves were not found after a hurricane. So for Guadeloupe, it was after a hurricane. For St. Eustatius, it was not the case. The remains were excavated by a team of archaeologists from Europe and the US, and they were commissioned by the government in St. Eustatius. So I'm going to read the positionality here from those organizations. We are hoping to protect the resting places of our ancestors. These sacred souls should not be disturbed by grave diggers whose only motive is to use taxpayers' money to ride academic glory into their own job profiles. They claim their motive is scientific, but how many bones do they need to disturb, if only to describe, the suffering of countless tortured souls? So Kenneth Cotterley is actually the head of this commission, petitioning to stop the excavations. These cultural and sensitive foreigners have carried out their toil on our soil. They have done so in a very disrespectful manner without following the protocols for community engagement and properly engaging with the descendant community beforehand as per the international codes of ethics. Two more quotes. As a member of the descendant community, we claim respectful treatment and reburial of the remains of our ancestors, structural engagement with us on all matters pertaining to archaeological project work and permanent memorial. This digging is unethical and has to stop. We are also approaching the offices of Curicom Reparations Commission to further our case. We are now seeking the attention, help, and guidance from African experts within the University of the West Indies to protect the resting places of our ancestors. We are lobbying African scholars, academics, archaeologists, and anthropologists. We are appealing to African sisters and brothers and African organizations in the diaspora to help us stop this colonial and barbaric attack on our ancestors' spirituality. And of course, so this is for St. Eustatius. Second organization that I want, or actually, I don't have time to open the site, and actually I don't want to us to fall into any technical problem, but here is the link for the petition to stop the excavations. So now the second organization I want to focus on is L'Omoubayo, Love for Them, which is a Guadeloupean grassroots organization that seeks to organize and manage yearly ceremonies honoring the memory of slave ancestors, rehabilitate the different sites of memory where the skeletons were found around the beaches in Guadeloupe. Here, this is a clip from a video that you can find on YouTube where the members of this organization explain what it means to them to have this place so that they can come back regularly every year and pay homage to the ancestors. And this place, as you can see them here, in a very kind of cradling the place. And again, 2 clips from the same video I just told you about. So here we have on the left the site where most of the bones were excavated, and it kind of goes more beyond that space. And we have the Atlantic Ocean on the right. So we have here 2 different spiritual reconnection to the land with the ancestors. The one in St. Eustatius, more radical, the activist side of the rememorialization, and with the petition, for example, and the activity by Lambert. In Archive Fever, a Freudian impression, Jacques Derrida proposes the term an archive to examine the dynamics of power and control of archives as a site, as an institution, but also as an object. With this concept, Derrida also discusses the instability of the archive, its survival, and the necessity to think the archive in the future. Derrida's term came as food for thought within an epistemological territory, namely post-colonial trauma and memory performance, that has evidently gained momentum and mobilized increasing interest in academic research and artistic productions of slavery, genocides, and various mechanisms of human exploitation and oppression. Hence, scholars, including myself, have recuperated the concepts to address the lack of archives on these tragedies of history, or to ponder on the entangled meaning of official archives. So by and large, the archive is understood as a key component of a memorializing program. An archive needs documentation. It requires the archives, but it needs to occupy the official archives and deconstruct it. Deconstruct its rigid structure and its authority and append it. Thus, the archives that we have here, the one from Lombayo and the one from the organization in St. Eustatius, demand the subaltern voices to be heard. The petition launched by the grassroots organization in St. Eustatius and the Guadeloupean Association, Lombayo, offered here, I believe, innovative critical interventions about how to work through the official iconography of enslaved Africans lying in the hold of a slave ship, as I showed you earlier. And second, they request an active participation to scholarly debates in the new field of the archaeology of slavery. While Lombayo does not reject the archaeological excavations, but actually they are more related to, they are in relation with the work of those archaeologists, and see actually the value of finally giving a voice to the slaves and tracing the past. It is clear from the statement that I read earlier that the grassroots organization in St. Eustatius have strong reservations about the methods and about, and what is important is about the identity of the scholars who will participate to the reconstruction of the archive, since they require, most importantly, scientists and scholars from the African diaspora to step in. Similarly, it is entangled around the notion of brotherhood, sisterhood, who can be a sister, who can be a brother, who can be an implicated agent in this practice. So I'm going to head slowly toward my conclusion. And I would like to do this by putting in conversation some seminal concepts, philosophical reasoning, modes of thinking, carved out by cultural critics, historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, poets. And this cross-disciplinary academic dialogue is, I truly believe, necessary as the diverse subjective modes of critique and the subjective experiences that I described call for new theoretical paradigms that pay attention to the multiplicity of personalities by various implicated agents, the descendants and the non-descendants. The cross-disciplinary study of temporary YouTube performances, this one actually, and from which I took the images. So the temporary YouTube performances of yearly planned commemorations, the study of burial landscapes and seascapes transformed into archaeological sites, the petitions claiming respectful treatment and reburial of the remains of slave ancestors, or asking for a decolonization of archaeological ethics, the regulations, and also the practices. The study of subaltern agency of grassroots civilians, all this can significantly expand the epistemological underpinnings and the methodologies of scholarly work on climate change and on working through the trauma of slavery. In silencing the past, anthropologist and historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot observed that theories of history grossly underestimate the size, the relevance, and the complexity of the overlapping sites where it is produced, notably outside of academia. We are all amateur historians with various degrees of awareness about our production. We also learn history for similar amateurs. Universities and university presses are not the only loci of production of historical narrative. End of quote. The Caribbean grassroots organization in Guadeloupe and St. Eustatius produced an archives outside academia that obviously compel us scholars in cultural theory to interrogate our critical methodologies. When I look at the profile of the presenters of this interdisciplinary conference, when I consider the insightful debates that we've had, the insightful presentation that we've had since this morning, I think about the benefits of cross-pollinate community engagement, creative spiritual art, critical theory, and the humanities for public good. In his article, Climate of History, cultural historian Dipesh Chakrabarty argues that what scientists have said about climate change challenges not only the ideas about the human, but also the analytical strategies that post-colonial and post-imperial historians have deployed in the last 2 decades in response to the post-war scenario of decolonization and globalization. End of quote. So you certainly notice the beginning of the title of my presentation borrows from Chakrabarty's title. By the climate of theory, I mean the ways in which climate change must change our perspective as activists, as artists, as poets, as scholars, as students, as environmentalists, to carve out new critical discourses that flash up with the constant danger that is climate change. In other words, how do we theorize the problems caused by global warming in a social and political context where historical trauma is caused by enslavement of nature and through nature? Beaches, ocean, and forest are historical loci where uncanny beauty contrasts with the ugliness and the tragedies of a violent history. By climate of theory, I also posit a reimagination of our critical lenses and frameworks. In dialogue with Valérie Loiseau, who in her recent book, Water Graves, contends that water death matters, I propose that a dialectical imagination matters in order to add layers of meaning to the history of transatlantic slavery and climate change. I want to conclude with this Ocean Poetics by Kamar Brathwaite. Brathwaite is a Barbadian poet and philosopher. Dialectics is part of a larger philosophical reasoning that Brathwaite initiated as he had a poetic vision of an old Jamaican woman repeatedly walking on the Atlantic Ocean, reconnecting the Caribbean to the African continent, and therefore reenacting her presence during the Middle Passage. What is the origin of the Caribbean? How do we come from? Where do we come from? And why are we as we are? Why are we so little less so fragmented, so perpetually caught up with the notion of hope, and still at the same time Sisyphean? Why is our psychology not dialectical, successfully dialectical in the way that Western philosophy has assumed people's lives should be, but dialectic, like our grandmothers, our nanas' action, like the movement of the ocean she's walking on, coming from one continent, continuum, touching another, and then receding, reaping from the islands into the perhaps creative chaos of their future. Dialectics is not a concept, it's a poesept. Here, the old grandmother walks freely on the ocean, building agency and offering a counter-narrative to the Middle Passage, and working through the trauma as a free agent. Dialectics interrogates the complex set of transactions, negotiations, and reappropriations of traumatic spaces, in this case, the ocean. Hurricanes Iris, Louis, and Marilyn have unveiled the ghosts of history and the geology of science, where enslaved bodies were moved into the soil of the violent space of the plantation, rematerialized no longer as the ghosts of history or the furniture of the Black Code, but as the human grammar that needs to be deciphered. The ecological and human disasters caused by the hurricanes, the uncanny beauty of the Caribbean, the historical violence that is the matrix of the region, clearly remind us what Suzanne Césaire in 1945 in the journal Tropic has theoretically assessed as a poetics of camouflage and ancestral anxiety. If my Antilles are so beautiful, it is because the great game of hide and seek has succeeded. It is then because on that day the weather is most certainly too blindingly right and beautiful to see clear. End of quote from Suzanne Césaire. When Hurricane Iris, Louis, and Marilyn made landfall in Guadeloupe in 1995, climate change and the hurricanes were deus ex machina that gave visibility to what was camouflaged. As for the Atlantic Ocean, it was symbolically the grave digger that excavated the skeletons. Before the discovery of the slave burial grounds, archaeologists studying slavery in the Caribbean, they were more or less navigating the archaeology of absence. Before the discoveries of the slave burial grounds, descendants of the African diaspora had no resting places for their enslaved ancestors, no tangible grave sites to mourn and spiritually cradle. The geology of silence, the notion of geology of silence, I borrowed from Catherine Yusuf's work on the Black Anthropocene, is now a geology of eruption and noise that nurtures a geopolitics of memory, where several grammars, theoretical paradigms, and subjectivities intervene and intertwine. The dialectic mentality and epistemology that we need to work with, I contend, is in dialogue with what Elizabeth Delagre articulates, and I quote, a merging of water and land, north and south, human and nature, end of quote. And this is my last paragraph. Nature, culture, beautiful seascape and landscape, trauma and resilience, implicated archaeologists, implicated descendants and activists, engaged communities, embodied experiences are all ingredients to mobilize energy and galvanize a critical and cross-disciplinary conversation on how to reconfigure and unearth the skeletons of history and how to carve out Black Atlantic eco-critical epistemologies in the time of climate change. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Kuti, the conference committee at Rice University for putting together and hosting this conference. It's really wonderful to be here, and I look forward to having a conversation afterward and tomorrow on this theme, in the path of disasters. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the different ways in which disasters, namely those during the French Third Republic, belied the myth of colorblindness that characterized and continues to characterize Republican France. In doing so, I hope to engage with contemporary debates about placing race within our understandings of history, how the history of race continues to shape the present, and I also hope to underscore the importance of resisting efforts in the United States, as in France, to whitewash history in favor of a myth of colorblind assimilation. I'll be employing examples from the turn of the century in the French Caribbean, a place where citizens of color occupied a liminal space within the French Republic, something that we dealt with earlier today when we were talking about Puerto Rico and its current relationship to the United States. One and the same time, French Caribbeans were seen as French and as other, as citizen and as subject, regardless of, after 1875, firm legal grounding in French citizenship. As we shall see, the Republican myth was potent and persuasive, though its shortcomings and blind spots were most apparent during periods of national catastrophe. The eruption of Mount Pelée in 1902 on the French island of Martinique was cast by contemporaries as a national tragedy for France, one that cut across the distance of the Atlantic and the societal divisions of the fin de siècle. Without regard for a person's wealth, skin tone, or background, contemporaries would lament 30,000 people perished in the blink of an eye, as the volcano, once thought dormant, Mount Pelée, blanketed what was known as the Little Paris of the Antilles in hot ash on Ascension Day in May 1902. It had destroyed the city of Saint-Pierre, which was seen as a microcosm of white France in the tropics. And it had brought the economic engine of France's cane sugar empire to its knees. For an entire generation, that fateful day seemed a specter of the dangers of nature and the inability of European civilization to work them, particularly so when it erupted for a second time in 1929. It even went so far as to help create the modern field of volcanology. For over a century, stories of Pelée have filled the pages of tourism brochures as a national catastrophe that, in the myth of colorblind France, brought the French population together to help their compatriots in need. And this kind of associating the French Caribbean with disaster and being emblematic of its role in French history, you need to look no further than the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who said in 1903, 1 year after the eruption, that, quote, "As a French colony, she, Martinique, will have been the object of an attention on behalf of the world that is sometimes justly jealous and sometimes moved by the greatest pity for her misfortunes," end quote. These misfortunes, the story went, led to national solidarity, a coming together that signaled the strength of France's convictions and adherence to liberty, equality, and fraternity. The union of spirit, the unity of spirit, a union sacrée of sorts, forged at the mercy of a hostile natural environment, is what led the minister of the colonies to remark on the 300-year anniversary of France's control of the French Caribbean, "The Antilles, how France is proud of you. You are one of the most noble jewels in her exotic crown, you who we call old colonies. The noble ideals of liberty, equality, and the brotherhood of races of 1789 and 1848 has ended the distinction of color, for your children as for ours." But does that sentiment accurately represent the reality for those who live their lives under prejudice for their skin color, or even for those who benefited from that prejudice? To put it differently, did disasters like Pelée truly display national unity stemming from 1789, or do we choose a date like 1794, the first time slavery was abolished, or 1848, when it was abolished for a second time, only to be delayed until the end of the harvest, sparking rebellions within the Caribbean itself? Or do we see in the workings of this language the remembrance of a racialized view of the world that actually reflects divisions that transformed a naturally occurring geophysical hazard into a disaster that killed 30,000 people? There's a second quote I'd like you to consider. The poet Saint-Léger, or Jean Peirce, as he was also known, once recounted to Paul Morand that his grandmother, an old Creole matriarch, ordinarily spoke of the catastrophe of Martinique, wherein there were 7,000 deaths. He would object that there were actually 40,000 victims. Ah, she would reply, only if you count the people of color. These two quotes, the first by Monsieur Rollin and the second by Jean Peirce's grandmother, represent two vastly different understandings of French history. One of pure colorblind assimilation rooted in Enlightenment ideals, and the other in the harsh realities, racial realities and hierarchies forged in the Atlantic slave trade that permeated and continues to plague French society. I'd like to engage with both, as one does not have to look far to find those who believe that so-called natural disasters must be colorblind. And frequently when I teach my disasters course, students tell me on the first day of color they don't understand why I would be talking about race in this class, because nature doesn't see color. And while some abstraction known as nature may not care one whit for the contours of human society, it is most definitely untrue to state that disasters do not follow these contours, whether they be racial or socioeconomic. A disaster, to follow in the words of Lau Juliet Carr, results from the collapse of cultural protections that ward off the worst effects of geophysical events, whether those be blizzards, storms, or in this case, volcanic eruptions. What those cultural protections look like, where their vulnerabilities lie, are profoundly shaped by cleavages and divisions within socioeconomic status, legal rights, access to sound shelter, quality of food, and recovery. Some of the things we've already talked about earlier today. The fantasy that disasters are colorblind, that they wash away the distinction between races or social divisions, making them indistinguishable by blanketing them under, as we'll see here in a minute, quote, a shroud of lava of ashes, is very deep-seated and widespread. One need not look far to find evidence, however, that France was and continues to be profoundly structured along class and race-based lines. As we can see in the contemporary soap advertisement here on the left, darkness of skin tone was seen as undesirable precisely because it was associated with poverty-stricken, what would be termed uncivilized spaces within the French Empire. On the right, we can see a Martiniquais woman being saved by the female embodiment of the French Republic, Lady Liberty, or Marianne, clad in armor with blonde hair, coming to rescue the unfortunate victims of France's old colony, one of France's oldest colonies during the eruption of Mount Pelée. Perhaps outside the bounds of this talk, the Caribbean presents an interesting case study as well, for as the common adage goes, money whitens the skin, though only to a certain extent. In other words, one's economic utility colors one's race, a theme taken up here by the deeply offensive soap advertisement, which says that basically if you buy this soap, it will whiten your skin or wash the dirt off of you. There's no way to make that not profoundly offensive. Any question of what lives matter must address the colonial legacy as well as the capitalist economy that is rooted and built by it. However, more recent activist movements count Black bodies in both France and the United States have been met by a forceful conservative backlash. In January of 2021, earlier this year, the French Minister of Higher Education called for a formal investigation into Islamo-Gauchisme or Islamo-leftism, specifically targeting French academics who study the legacies and current realities of race and racism in France. The Minister of Higher Education's argument was that France is colorblind, that all share common citizenship under the umbrella of French republicanism, and consequently the study of race and racism is an import in the United States. They argue that France's sister republic, the United States, imported that idea because the United States had not yet learned the values of radical colorblindness. But you don't need to go far to find that same sort of logic here in the United States, where I think the count now is up to 12 out of the 50 states have banned critical race theory in all public schools, and with some states going so far as to ban them in institutions of higher education. In the words of Frédéric Vidal, the French minister, these ideas feed, quote, a hatred of whites and of France. These claims would not have been out of place 100 years ago, when the minister of the colonies then celebrated, quote, the prosperity and grandeur of the Republican family, while willfully ignoring inequities forged in colonialism. For instance, Theodore Baud, the president of the society behind the 300-year anniversary of French rule in the Caribbean, would address the town of Saint-Pierre and the mayor, tracing the colony's path to assimilation beginning in 1635 with French occupation of the island, asserting that the French and Antillean hearts, quote, have merged for 3 centuries, awaiting that day, which should not be long in coming, of complete assimilation, end quote. Such formulations of French colorblindness overlooked economic inequities grounded in racial prejudice. Just 4 years after that tricentenary, on the 150-year anniversary of the French Revolution, colonial societies warned that Martinique's governor was allowing, quote, women from the colonies who have no profession, no status, no references, and who come under the false pretense of working in mainland France. They come to Paris at what cost, we don't know. They sign up for public welfare assistance and put a burden on French society. Many of those women were moving to France precisely because 3 years before that tricentenary, Pele had erupted for a second time, causing the mass evacuation of about 10,000 people from the northern half of the island. This had uncomfortable resonances with the experience following the eruption of Pele in 1902 itself, when colonial migration from the Antilles had posed a real problem for the French government. Many would leave for mainland France or elsewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean in search of work and economic opportunity. Colonial governments in the Antilles were actually, in the decades that followed, tasked with tracking those who had left the island, often deciding whether to sponsor their travel to mainland France or in fact forcibly repatriate them back to the islands due to their own, in their words, indigence. If an Antillean society were found to be indigent, the French state would send them back, in other words, to Martinique or Guadeloupe. The governors of Martinique and Guadeloupe fielded numerous requests for this repatriation process throughout the 1920s and 30s. And as I mentioned before, this would hit a tipping point when Pele erupted a second time in 1929. About 7,700 individuals were forced from northern Martinique into official refugee camps, with another 2,000 dispersed across the island to live with family and friends. Despite claims by some in the French legislature, mostly radical left deputies, that, quote, we cannot leave these refugees in their present situation. We have always considered our colonies, and above all those of the Antilles, as French departments, end quote. Tight-fisted colonial inspectors would be sent to the island to assess conditions, and they would downplay damage reports specifically and in their own words to justify keeping costs down and rebuilding, congratulating the French state for moving the population out of the way of physical harm while paying no heed to the disruption that caused. Meanwhile, the government provided little to make up for the widespread social costs of the disaster. To give you one example, which I think is very telling, anyone who is deemed of working age, specifically people of color, would receive absolutely no assistance from the state, no monetary aid. They would only get, in the words of official documentation, quote, bureaus endeavoring to find them work. In the years following the disaster, numerous Martinique families would leave the island for Paris and elsewhere in the Caribbean, never to return. The awakening of Pele in 1929, which didn't end until 1932, would actually convince many that even continuing France's relationship with the island was simply too costly. For instance, at the end of that eruption, one French admiral actually suggested to the state that they sell the island to the United States. And this brings us back to a central contention of my presentation. The adage here quoted from Russell Dines that natural disasters are social rather than natural phenomena. In looking at the worst moments of a nation, you can see a confluence of a rhetoric of, in the case of France, a civilizing mission or something akin to Republican belongingness, with the realities of the natural environment as it runs up against the contours of inequity in society. In other words, disasters, or the kind of that meeting of the natural world with the rest of nature, the component of the rest of the nature called humanity, provides a vibrant backdrop to explore the intersections between race, class, and colorblindness as they relate to a nation's sense of self. So-called natural disasters are interesting precisely due to their societal dimension. They heighten inequities that predate them, even as they hold the possibility of people overcoming those inequities and perhaps giving voice to their better angels. And this brings us back to the selective counting of Jean Perce's grandmother, who is not alone in her sentiment. In writing to the time, it was commonplace to single out the number of white lives lost in the total deaths from Pélé's eruption. One such economic treatise in 1905 spoke only of the white deaths, much like Jean Perce's grandmother. Moreover, the former treasury of Martinique put it immediately following the eruption, quote, with the inhabitants of Saint-Pierre, the elite of the colony disappeared, and at the same time, nearly all the local fortune, the loss of the most useful souls, the creative forces themselves were annihilated. The sense was echoed by a correspondent from the Petit Journal who claimed that, quote, the blacks of Martinique loudly proclaimed their joy at the whites who died in the catastrophe. They believed for a moment that the white race was exterminated and they were considered masters of their colony. These racialized responses stand in stark contrast to the official narrative that France was and is colorblind in the wake of disasters. Some fantasize that the disasters of Pélé would actually force France to put aside its racial divisions to live up to the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. As one observer explained, quote, the terrible catastrophe that annihilated 1/6 of the black population and half of the white population put Martinique in mourning for a long time. Those who were divided by implacable racial hatred just yesterday now lie under the same shroud of lava and ashes. The idea was that disaster would render race indistinguishable under a banner of republicanism and a blanket of suffering. But many contemporaries knew Republican claims to colorblindness and assimilation to be rather farcical. For instance, following a rash of fires just 3 years prior to the eruption, one left-wing paper, Le Peuple, would sum it up, quote, one would believe that since the dawn of the Republic, prejudice based on color has disappeared in the colonies. Error, like a vivacious plant, prejudice of color has survived by transforming. The fact of the matter is that economic realities make some people more vulnerable, while others are more quick to recover. Le Peuple continued, quote, our markets are empty, our shops are poor because we produce cane sugar, and nothing but cane sugar. Similarly, following the eruption of Mount Pélé, Jean Hess complained that republicanism and compatriotism could not overcome racial and socioeconomic issues plaguing the colony, wondering, quote, maybe there are others in whom the passions of race, caste, and class don't obscure reason, just not here. The colorblindness of French nation building was predicated on the economic prosperity of its colonial holding. The wealthier those colonies would become, the more French they seemed in Republican ideology. But disasters frequently cast the denizens of the Caribbean into economic and physical misfortune, thus uncovering the lie that French nation building, all could become equal in the eyes of a colorblind republic. Among the wealthy on the islands, property was paramount. The plight of the poor and of the people of color frequently fell on disinterested ears. By the early 1900s, the French strongly associated the French Caribbean, what many would call our poor Antilles, with a confluence of repeated natural catastrophes, a failing monocultural sugar economy, and racial antipathy. On top of a bleak list of natural catastrophes proving the inclemency of nature, one contemporary wrote, quote, blacks who became their own masters after universal suffrage think of only exacting revenge on their ancient oppressors. This is why the fertile soil of the Caribbean Isles remains underexploited. And this idea that the French Caribbean was really just a fertile land that needs to be exploited and have its wealth extracted. We've already seen the tragic consequences of that in an earlier talk on Haiti. As Eduardo Bonilla Silva explained last year in the context of the still continuing COVID-19 pandemic, quote, colorblind infused discussions are dangerous precisely because they transpire in a mostly innocent, nice manner that obscures differential mortality and prevents dealing with the structural nature of the various racial problems that make geophysical events into disasters. In France, as in the United States, both hit hard by COVID-19, It is imperative now as ever that we examine the intricate relationship between Republican ideology and white supremacy, between colonialism and the melting pot ideal. Disasters heighten social cleavages and can spark reactionary movements that can wreak havoc on the notion of universal human rights. Colorblindness, by contrast, presumes whiteness, it elides difference, and it ignores the impact of historical inequities. In the context of the French Caribbean's repeated disasters, colorblindness shaped the government's preference for the wealthy and powerful, for the white elite of the island and the metropolitan financiers who backed them. In the name of colorblindness, French colonial elites and officers failed to count Black bodies, seeing them as replaceable assets, if not outright property, after the formal end of slavery, rather than as fellow citizens. While they suffered, they offered not respite, but re-employment. As the world continues to debate which lives matter, it is essential that we recount accurate histories that deliberately include people of color in steadfast opposition to Jean Perce's grandmother's willful ignorance about the suffering of non-white individuals in the Caribbean. Those whose death, in her view, only gets tallied if one deigns to, quote, count the people of color, those in the path of disaster. That is the 1 minute over time. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was great. So I think we'll have time for like maybe one or two questions. So I'm going to ask people in the audience if you want to put something in the chat. No, people online, if you want to put something in the chat, help yourself. People in the audience, if you have questions, if you're at the back, come a bit closer so that the mic can get your beautiful voices. If you don't have questions, I've got plenty. So, and then I will just move here. Yes.
Thank you so much for both of your presentations. So when I listened to both of you, I couldn't help but think about a notion of sites of oblivion, les lieux de l'oubli, and so Guy Benner, who mentioned skeleton, right? So in the case of Dr. Curtius' presentation, like there's a physical skeleton, and so there's skeleton that are keep being buried in the narrative, right, as well. So I'm just wondering with what other notions may be associated to this lieu as tangent to l'oral, lieu de mémoire, lieu de traumatisme, nœud de mémoire, which other notions do you maybe think through to think about this counter history that is like necessary, this new narrative that is necessary to happen, to unbury and bury again properly those bodies. So in both cases.
Want to start?
I can be quick. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens is that sites of, I mean, remembrance and commemoration can very quickly become a site of oblivion. I think that's what's happening, what you see happening in the 1935 tricentenary, is that just 3 years prior, Pele had erupted for the second time in a generation. Those from the first families of the first eruption were actually still submitting claims to the French state asking for assistance that were being denied. Then there was a new wave of assistance requests, a new wave of out-migration from the island, and then basically everyone gathers in Saint-Pierre to talk about the 300 glorious years of French rule and commemorate the 150-year anniversary of the French Revolution. And so I think what you're seeing is literally the overriding of that disaster history and the remembrance of it.
Thank you for your question, Lucia, which is really important because this is precisely what I was kind of thinking about as I was writing the paper. The necessity for a new vocabulary that will help us work through the trauma as descendants as well as non-descendants. And the notion of oblivion is really important because here in the two situations that we both analyzed, we have a constant circle of, memory, commemoration, opposition, memory, commemoration, opposition, and then, this circles again over and over again, and then we find ourselves in a position where we don't necessarily clearly see how we can kind of pinpoint one without leaving the other one aside. So, as I was saying, I think that we really need a vocabulary, and that's the reason why I was kind of thinking more in terms of the notion of geology that Catherine yourself actually kind of proposed in a wonderful little book, A Billion Black Anthropocene, where the land itself, where those bodies are molded, and the land which actually gives us back those bodies probably could offer some vocabulary. And this is where, in terms of vocabulary, that I think that poetry would be very interesting. Because again, as I was writing this paper, I was deeply into poetry, into the quest for metaphors, images that would help me go through the different elements, the different ingredients that I had and I needed to compose. So maybe a poetic vocabulary would be a good way to start with. Nœud de mémoire is so powerful because it both includes the oblivion and the commemoration and the sites and all those elements, all those ingredients. So, so I guess that I don't necessarily have a term, but I'm just kind of saying maybe we need to kind of think ourselves like the new poets of this new grammar, this new memorializing grammar that we need to compose each of us, wherever we come from and whatever position we whatever position we occupy as we go through this.
Thank you. And I really think your new term can be, should be, take it however you want, but grounded in effects, right? And it's something you meant, like when you think about archive and that the archival feelings, right? It's like how that offers, as you say, like a narrative to those sites, like that are material but not effective, right? Into it, and effective even more to memorializing that past. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Siam.
It was interesting from the perspective of disaster studies. For disaster scholars, there is nothing but effects. It's the distinction that in the last 40 years or so they've made. Most of the time we talk about a disaster striking, like someone like Nebraska, that makes no sense. Yeah. Because there are geophysical event cycles of cyclones that are just there. Every year they're going to come. They may be of stronger intensity, but the effects is what produces the disaster. So the only way to actually understand the disaster is to unpack its effects, those uneven effects, those vulnerabilities, everything that predated when that geophysical hazard actually arrived.
There is also this dynamics of masking and unmasking, coding and uncoding. So we constantly play with those words and their oppositions, and this is where again I think that poetry can really be helpful.
Thank you, Siam. So we don't have a lot of time left, so I would just ask a question before we break for our last session, where we're going to have Provost Reginald DesRoches joining us. So my question is about violence, and it's for both of you. Because we live in a world where sometimes science is being rationalized and we're trying to be neutral and not talk about affect, but the way interaction happens are kind of violence. So I'm thinking about you, Annie, talking about how those bones are being, brought back to the surface because of a hurricane, because of a violent element. So it just seems that without violence, the truth is not coming out. So that's the first problem. And then for you, Chris, it's this idea of, so you gave us numbers and your presentation was great, but you also pinpoint the question, the French notion of universalism. And universalism, and there's so many things we could say about that. But then when you quote Saint-Jean-Pierre's, his mother's comment about, oh, well, we don't count the Black people. And then I found this particularly violent, particularly if you think about this universalist promise. And in all my readings for the second book, and by the way, you quoted in it, because you're talking about this. And I was like, oh, numbers, nice. And I like the distinctions you did, is this idea that you have a promise, we own a part of France. And then when we're dead, you're like, oh, we only are going to count the white people. So that for me is kind of very violent. So I want both of you to quickly talk about this idea of violence in this, even the notion of disasters.
I think that what is really intriguing and at the same time disturbing for me is that in order to make sense out of this violence, we have to dig into the violence and kind of protect ourselves at the same time. And because it's not an easy subject to deal with. I perfectly understand, for example, why the organization St. Eustatius believe that the excavation are violent and that there is a need for a more spiritual approach to the skeletons. But at the same time, I do believe that leaving space to the archaeologists so that they can tell us more about the material culture of the slaves is also important. So what I see here is that in order to address violence, we have to step into the violent space and be ready to come out of it with something that is going to be sufficiently smoothing, so sufficiently emancipate. I mean, kind of find some emancipatory dynamics out of the violence. And this is what is difficult. If I can't actually be a little bit closer to you, I would say that writing this paper was really difficult for me. Because I was actually digging into this very moment where I could see the skeletons, I could see the violence behind those bodies that were just left behind the backshore dunes. And there was something really moving inside of me that kept me at some point away from the paper for some days. And then I had to go back to the paper. So I think that we have no choice, Jackie. We have to dig into the violence, but we have to find the right grammar, the right attitude to not let ourselves swallow up by the violence. And again, this is where poetry is going to be.
Thank you, Annie. Please.
For me, I would say that, being a disaster historian, you would think I would pin the violence on nature, but I would pin it on humans. There's the violence, the human component of the disaster equation is usually far more violent, largely because the vulnerabilities that are there that make this geophysical hazard into a disaster were created by us. By us, I mean by society at large. And in the last, several hundred years, by the growth toward global capitalism and its notion of creative destruction. So there are those for whom disasters are violent. There are those who profit immensely through construction contracts and rebuilding neighborhoods that are built back to better than they were prior standards. And there are for those who, in the 1891 hurricane. Colonial investigators going to the French Caribbean basically saying these houses, you know, we put aside any of the inherent value of the people that live there. If we look at them just from a market value standpoint, they're not worth anything in the market value, therefore we won't give any money for it. That's violence. That is the, you know, we can't change, and you know, climate change aside, the human activities that are producing and increasing greenhouse gases, but largely we can't do away with geophysical hazards. There's something that we always need to mitigate to work on. What is violent is when we allow those geophysical hazards to have such uneven and lasting consequences, and then drape over it this gloss or veneer of universalism to say, no, we've benefited everything, we've rebuilt. It's like we've only rebuilt for a very small slice of the population. And the small slice of the population rebuilt, like we talked about earlier, is not the lower ninth floor, which now has tons of empty plots in it. You know, it's the higher ground, it's the sliver up against Mississippi.
Thank you so much. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us for a very fruitful and heavy, maybe also hopeful conversation. Please join us at 5:15 to have the closing remark by the provost, soon to be president, Reginald DeRoche. And if you cannot do this, please join us tomorrow. Very exciting sessions too. So it was our pleasure to have you today. I will see some of you in 10 to 15 minutes or others tomorrow. Thank you so much.